In the quiet chill of a Seattle morning, billionaire Richard Hamilton arrives at his son's grave only to find a young woman and two small boys weeping before it. When he demands they leave, the woman reveals a truth that shatters everything he thought he knew. The twins are his late son's children, and in that instant a hidden past collides with a dangerous future. Richard Hamilton never thought grief could become a routine, yet for 3 years it had carved itself into the foundation of his life with the precision of a blade. Every month, on the 12th day without fail, he left behind his penthos on Mercer Island, the conference rooms packed with executives, and the empire built from steel and relentlessness. He drove his black Bentley up the winding path that led to Lakeview Cemetery, Seattle's sweeping hillside landscape where the wealthy secured plots as grand as their legacies. The cemetery's old maple trees framed the road like colossal sentinels, their branches stretching across the sky in tangled silhouettes as if they might shield the dead from the world that continued turning without them. For Richard, these visits were not acts of sentimentality but obligations, rituals of duty, devotion, and punishment. They marked a debt he could never repay, the life of his only child, Ethan Hamilton. Ethan's death had unstitched something in Richard that power, money, and control could not mend. It had fractured the core of his identity, leaving behind a hollow echo where certainty once lived. People whispered that Ethan had been the softer Hamilton, kind where his father was ruthless, warm where his father was calculating. Richard had always dismissed those comments, refusing to acknowledge any weakness in his hair. But now, standing alone in the shadow of Ethan's mausoleum month after month, he sometimes wondered if those people had seen something he never bothered to look at. The truth was he didn't recognize his son's last years, not his moods, not his distance. Not the way Ethan had begun slipping out of their world piece by piece. Richard had been too busy polishing the Hamilton legacy to notice the cracks forming beneath it. That morning, as he stepped out of the car, the sky stretched in a soft gradient of gray over the hills. He clutched the fresh bouquet of white calla lilies in one hand, the only flowers Ethan ever tolerated. No roses, Ethan would joke. I'm not dead yet. Richard had always rolled his eyes at that, annoyed by the morbid humor. Now the memory stabbed him with an irony so sharp he could barely breathe. He followed the familiar stone path leading toward the massive marble structure built in Ethan's honor. A monument so extravagant it looked like something cut straight from the courtyard of a European palace. People had criticized the mausoleum when it was built too big, too dramatic, too expensive, but Richard didn't care. If he couldn't protect his son in life, he would protect the memory of him in death, even if it cost millions. Money, after all, was the only language he had ever spoken fluently. He approached the mausoleum expecting the usual stillness, expecting to be alone with his grief. Instead, he froze mid-step. Someone was kneeling in front of Ethan's grave, 3 someones, actually. A young woman, dressed in an oversized beige coat that had seen better years, and 2 little boys who clung to her sides. Their knees were pressed against the grass, their small heads bowed, shoulders shaking as though they were caught in the raw grip of heartbreak. The woman's dark hair whipped across her cheeks with each gust of wind, and her hands trembled as she tried to pull the twins closer. Their jackets were thin, far too thin for the early Seattle morning, and their sneakers were scuffed as if they had been worn through more than one childhood. At first, Richard didn't process what he was seeing. Visitors sometimes came to admire the Hamilton mausoleum, tourists fascinated by wealth. Others came by mistake, searching for relatives buried nearby. But these 3 didn't look curious or lost, they looked devastated, as if they had come to mourn someone they had truly loved. And that to Richard was unacceptable. No one loved Ethan more than he did. No one had the right to invade this space he had carved from his own shattered heart. As he stepped forward, something hot and volatile surged inside him. It wasn't just anger, it was intrusion, violation. Grief was the only thing Richard had left, and even that felt fragile and threatened by the sight before him. He stormed toward them, his footsteps hard against the gravel. "What are you doing here?" he snapped, his voice carrying through the cemetery with a force that made the twins flinch. The woman jerked her head up, eyes red, her face pale and exhausted as though she had been fighting an invisible war for years and losing. She looked young, far too young to be drowning in that much sorrow. The boys pressed themselves closer to her, gripping her sleeves, frightened by the towering figure of the billionaire whose face was etched with fury. "This is private property," Richard said, gesturing sharply toward the mausoleum. "This is my family's grave. You have no business here." His words came out clipped, each syllable sharpened by pain. He wanted them gone. He needed gone before something inside him cracked open wider. The woman swallowed hard and rose to her feet despite shaking legs. She stepped slightly in front of the twins, protective even in fear. "Mess. Hamilton, she whispered, recognizing him immediately. Everyone in Seattle knew his face. I'm sorry, we didn't mean to upset you. Her voice trembled, but her gaze held something stubborn beneath the fear, something almost desperate. We came because Ethan meant something to us. Richard felt the air drain from his lungs. The audacity of that statement ricocheted through him. What are you talking about? He demanded. You didn't know my son. The woman's eyes filled again with tears, but she didn't look away. I did, she said. I knew him better than you think. She placed a hand gently on each boy's shoulder, and they knew him too. The twins lifted their heads, their eyes were brown, warm, golden-flecked, achingly familiar. A shade Richard had seen reflected in Ethan's face since the day he was born. A dizzy, nose-eating swell of disbelief rippled through him, but he pushed it down violently. Coincidence, nothing more. The woman took a shaky breath. My name is Emily Carter, she said, and these are my sons Liam and Noah. She hesitated, then let the truth spill out before she lost her courage. They were Ethan's children. The world did not tilt, but it felt like it did. The wind seemed to stop, the sky seemed to dim. The rage in Richard's chest turned into something heavier, colder, something that felt like the beginning of an avalanche. He stared at the boys, at their familiar eyes, at their trembling hands, and for the first time in years, something inside him felt dangerously unsteady. Because if what Emily said was true, then he wasn't just looking at strangers kneeling at his son's grave. He was looking at the last pieces of Ethan Hamilton still breathing in this world. Richard Hamilton could not remember the last time someone had spoken to him with such trembling honesty, and for a moment his mind refused to process the meaning of Emily Carter's words. Ethan's children, the phrase slammed against him like a blunt force, impossible to absorb all at once. He stared at the boys again, at the way they clung to their mother, at the matching curls that brushed their foreheads, at the unmistakable shade of their eyes, those warm golden flecks that had run through his family for generations. A hereditary signature he had always imagined Ethan would one day pass down, but not like this, not in a cemetery, not through strangers kneeling at his son's grave. His heartbeat thudded heavily, frustration mixing with dread as he stepped closer. You need to leave, he said, his tone sharp enough to carve through the cold morning air. I won't have anyone using my son's name to play games. Emily flinched as though struck, but she didn't back away. Her jaw tightened, and Richard could see the flicker of resolve beneath her tear-streaked face. I'm not playing anything, she whispered. I'm telling you the truth. Richard scoffed, though it came out weaker than he intended. Truth, my son never mentioned you, not once. That detail bothered him more than anything. Ethan had shared so little during his final years, always brushing off questions about his personal life with vague excuses. Richard had assumed it was rebellion, a stage, perhaps even resentment. He hadn't imagined secrets this deep. Emily swallowed, then reached into her worn coat pocket and retrieved a small photograph protected by layers of tape to keep it from falling apart. She held it out to him with trembling fingers. Richard hesitated. Something in him resisted the idea of touching anything she had brought. But curiosity, sharp and toxic, forced his hand. When he finally took the photo and flipped it over, the breath in his chest fractured. Ethan stood in the center of the picture, younger, brighter, happier than Richard had seen him in years. He was holding two newborns wrapped in yellow blankets, his smile wide enough to crease both cheeks. And beside him, nestled against his arm, was Emily. She looked younger too, her hair pulled back, her eyes full of exhaustion and joy. Ethan's arm was around her shoulders, pulling her close, not out of obligation but love, real, unguarded love. There, scribbled on the back of the photo in Ethan's loopy handwriting, were the words, my whole world. Emily, Liam, no. Dated 6 years ago. Richard's stomach twisted. The reality pressed down on him with suffocating weight. This doesn't prove anything, he said too quickly. Photos can be faked. Even as the protest left his mouth, he knew how weak it sounded. The photo was too natural, too flawed at the edges, too undeniably genuine. No fabrication looked that alive. Emily inhaled shakily. Ethan visited us every day. He fed the boys. He read them bedtime stories. He held them until they fell asleep. He loved them, Mr. Hamilton. He loved all three of us. Her voice cracked at the end, but she kept her head high. Richard felt a burning sensation spreading across his chest, painful and unfamiliar, anger, confusion, betrayal. None of it felt clean or separate. If what you're saying is true, he said slowly, why the hell didn't Ethan tell me? He didn't realize his voice had risen until both boys shrank against their mother's legs. I think you know why, Emily replied softly. The accusation hit its mark with brutal accuracy. Richard stiffened. Of course he knew. He had mapped out Ethan's future from the moment the boy could walk. Top-tier schools, Ivy League education, a place in Hamilton's steel, a marriage that would merge their wealth with another influential family. He carved a life path with no room for deviation. Those choices, he always believed, were the foundations of success. Now standing face to face with the consequences, he wasn't so sure. Emily's voice wavered but remained steady enough to hold its shape. He was afraid of you. He said you would never accept me, never accept our boys. He wanted to tell you so many times, but he knew it would change everything. Richard almost barked a laugh, humorless, jagged, but it died in his throat. For the first time, the possibility dawned on him that Ethan had been living an entire second life, one Richard knew nothing about. A life built outside Hamilton expectations. A life he might have cherished more than the one Richard had built for him. A sharp wind swept across the cemetery, rustling the dead leaves around their feet. Richard tightened his grip on the bouquet he'd brought for Ethan. The lilies were slightly crushed now, petals bent from his clenched hand. Something bitter rose in him. So that's it, he said. You show up here expecting me to what, hand you money? Support some story you've created. His voice sounded harsh even to himself. Emily's expression flickered from hurt to resolve. I don't want your money. She looked down at Liam and no. I just wanted them to see where their father rests. They missed him. They still talk about him. Liam tugged lightly on her sleeve as if seeking reassurance. The older twin raised his gaze to Richard, eyes filled with a cautious curiosity. Mom says this is where Daddy sleeps, he murmured, his voice small and unsure, the pronunciation soft around the edges. Are you really his daddy's daddy? The question pierced Richard in a way nothing else had. The boy's face, hopeful, frightened, familiar, threw Richard off balance. He opened his mouth but no words came out. How could he answer when he didn't understand any of this himself? Emily knelt beside her sons, wrapping her arms around them. Boys, she whispered, her voice trembling with exhaustion, this is your grandfather. The word stuck in Richard's throat like a stone. Grandfather, it felt surreal, improbable, unwanted. Yet when Liam and No looked up at him, it was as if he were staring into Ethan's eyes again, small mirrors reflecting pieces of the child he had raised, the boy he had buried, the man he had never fully known. The weight of that recognition pressed into his bones. Richard stepped back, suddenly unsteady. He needed air, he needed distance. Everything in his life had been built on control, predictability, order. This woman, these children, threatened the very architecture of the world he thought was unbreakable. He wanted to tell them to leave, he wanted to deny everything. But a small voice tugged at him, quiet, unwelcome, persistent, the voice he had ignored when Ethan drifted away from him. The voice that whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had played a role in the distance between them. He didn't want to hear that voice now. He lifted his chin, masking the turmoil with cold authority. Give me your contact information, he said. I'll look into all of this. Emily blinked, unsure whether this was a threat or an olive branch, but she nodded. She scribbled a phone number and the address of a temporary shelter on a torn receipt from her pocket. Richard took the paper and slipped it into his coat. The moment he did, something in him shifted just slightly, just enough for a dangerous idea to take shape. If the boys truly were Ethan's sons, then they were Hamilton's. They deserved a Hamilton life, the kind he defined, the kind he controlled. Emily lifted her sons again, preparing to leave. Liam waved a small hand at the mausoleum before turning away. By Daddy, he whispered. The sound cracked something inside Richard so deeply he had to look away. As Emily walked down the stone path, Richard remained frozen in place. His eyes lingered on the twins until they disappeared from view. Only then did he let out a strained breath. He stared at Ethan's name etched into marble and murmured through clenched teeth, "Why didn't you tell me?" But no answer came, only the weight of new truths settling like concrete around his feet, reshaping everything he thought he understood. Richard stood frozen long after Emily and the twins disappeared through the cemetery gates. His legs felt heavy, his breath uneven, his grip still locked around the crumpled bouquet he had intended to lay on Ethan's grave. The lilies now hung limp from his hand, their stems bent and bruised. He didn't place them on the headstone. Somehow, it no longer felt appropriate, like the presence of those flowers would acknowledge a version of his son that lacked the truth now forcing its way into Richard's chest. He finally exhaled and stepped back from the mausoleum, but his mind remained tangled in the woman's words, the photograph, the boy's familiar eyes. His heart churned with a sense of betrayal, but it wasn't only toward Emily or even the children, it was toward Ethan. A raw, simmering frustration spread through him like wildfire. How could Ethan hide something this monumental? How could he build an entire family behind Richard's back, while Richard poured everything into shaping his future? Yet a deeper, darker thought crept beneath the anger. What had he done to make his son afraid to tell him? He shoved that question away violently, unwilling to entertain something so corrosive. He returned to his car and sat for a long moment before driving off. The world outside the windshield looked blurry, distant, the manicured lawns, the rows of expensive tomes, the stone angels carved by world-renowned sculptors. It all felt suddenly hollow. He started the engine anyway and guided the Bentley out of the cemetery, though his thoughts stayed behind, circling around the site of two boys who carried Ethan's heritage more clearly than any DNA test needed to prove. The drive back to Mercer Island twisted through neighborhoods of towering pines, wealthy estates, and glimmering views of Lake Washington. Normally, Richard found solace in this route. The familiar environment, the security of privilege, it insulated him from the chaos of the world. But today he felt exposed, as if the landscape itself judged him. His mind replayed every detail of the encounter: Emily's worn coat, the boys' thin jackets, the desperation in her voice when she said they didn't want anything from him. He hadn't believed her at first. A lifetime in business had taught him that everyone who approached a man like him wanted something: money, influence, favors. But the fear in her eyes didn't look greedy. It looked shattered. When he arrived home, the Hamilton estate rose before him in all its architectural grandeur. A sprawling mansion of glass and stone perched above the lake, its modern edges cutting sharply into the hillside. Normally, the sight filled him with a sense of pride, proof of the empire he had built through ruthless efficiency and unwavering discipline. Today it felt like a fortress built on neglect. He stepped inside, greeted by the soft hum of the central heating and the faint scent of polished wood. His housekeeper nodded respectfully as he passed, but he barely acknowledged her. He moved straight to his study and shut the door behind him before sinking into the leather chair at his desk. He pulled the photograph out of his coat and set it before him. The desk lamp cast a warm glow over Ethan's smile, a smile Richard hadn't seen in years. It felt like a punch to the gut. Ethan looked alive, joyful, free, and he had never once looked that way with Richard. As the minutes ticked by, Richard found himself studying the smallest details of the photo: the way Ethan's fingers curled protectively around the infants, the way Emily leaned into him naturally, the unfiltered happiness etched into their faces. Richard's throat tightened unexpectedly. He tried to suppress the emotion, but it clung to him stubbornly. Part of him wanted to rip the picture in half. Another part wanted to lock it in a safe. But the part that spoke loudest wanted to reclaim what he believed should have been his all along: his family's bloodline, his legacy, his grandson and great-grandson. The idea grew like a seed planted in soil too rich to resist. He could offer those boys everything they lacked: stability, wealth, opportunity, real education, real homes, real futures. Emily, from the looks of her, could barely afford warm clothing. The shelter address she wrote on the receipt told its own story. Richard felt his jaw tighten. That was no life for Hamilton descendants. Ethan would have wanted better for them. Richard decided he would give them better, whether Emily cooperated or not. But first he needed answers, hard, verifiable facts. If the boys truly were Ethan's, he would need more than a photograph. And if they weren't, he would need to expose the lie. Either way, he wouldn't let this situation slip through his fingers. Not when involved the last remnants of his son. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. The line rang once before a man answered. Hamilton. Robert, Richard said, leaning back in his chair. I need you. Robert Alvarez was Richard's private investigator, unofficially his fixer. He handled everything Richard preferred not to appear involved in. What's the situation? Robert asked. I want a full background check on someone. A woman named Emily Carter, mid to late 20s. Currently staying at a temporary shelter in downtown Seattle. Richard gave him the partial address from the receipt. She claims to have known my son. Claims her twins belong to him. There was a brief pause. You think she's telling the truth? Robert asked. I think she believes what she's saying, Richard replied. And I want to know if she has any reason to. Robert hummed thoughtfully. All right. I will dig into her employment history, personal records, birth certificates for the boys, medical documents if available. Anything else? Yes, Richard's voice hardened. Find out what kind of life she's been providing. Schools, doctors, housing, anyone who can testify to their living conditions. He hesitated only briefly before adding, and see if Ethan ever interacted with her. I want witnesses, photos, timestamps, whatever exists. Understood, Robert replied. Give me a week. 3 days, Richard corrected. Money isn't an issue. A low laugh came through the speaker. With you it never is. I'll call with updates. Richard hung up and stared again at the photo, his emotions twisted into a complex mixture of sorrow, fury, and determination. He stood and moved to the broad window overlooking the lake. The water shimmered under the late morning sky, reflecting the blues and silvers of the passing clouds. It was beautiful, serene, an environment Ethan would have enjoyed, if Ethan had told him the truth, if he had brought his sons home, if he had trusted him. But then again, Richard had never made trust easy. He turned away from the window and returned to his desk, his decision made. Whether this was a blessing or a threat, he would take control. He always did. And if those boys were Hamilton's, he would reclaim them from the unstable world Emily had raised them in. He would pull them into the legacy Ethan never lived long enough to fulfill. For the first time in years, Richard felt a familiar fire ignite inside him: purpose, determination, a mission that transcended grief. He didn't know it yet, but this mission would soon take him down a path darker than anything he had walked before. And every step he took would push Emily Carter and the truth further into danger. 3 days felt both impossibly long and shockingly short for Richard Hamilton, who spent every hour fluctuating between agitation and calculation. He went through his meetings mechanically, signed documents he barely read, and nodded through board presentations he usually dissected with surgical precision. His executives whispered among themselves, wondering what had shaken the famously unshakable Hamilton patriarch. None dared ask. Richard's mind was elsewhere, stuck on 2 small boys he had never known existed and the woman who claimed to have loved his son. On the morning of the 3rd day, his phone buzzed while he was in the middle of reviewing a major acquisition proposal. The caller had showed the name he had been waiting for. Without excuse or explanation, he stepped out of the conference room and answered. "Tell me you have something," he said. Robert's voice crackled through the receiver. "I have more than something, I have everything." Richard's chest tightened with anticipation. "Then meet me at the house." 20 minutes later, Robert Alvarez entered the Hamilton mansion with a thick black folder under his arm. He took a seat across from Richard's desk. Glancing around the polished office lined with framed business awards and photographs of Richard standing with political leaders and CEOs. But there were almost no pictures of Ethan, just one from his high school graduation tucked on a lower shelf, half hidden behind a steel award Richard had received years ago. Robert noticed Richard didn't. "Start talking," Richard said, leaning forward. Robert opened the folder. Emily Carter, 28 years old, born in Tacoma, no criminal record, high school diploma. Worked in a series of service jobs: diners, cleaning companies, convenience stores, nothing suspicious. No history of substance abuse. No psychiatric issues. People describe her as quiet, hardworking, and exhausted. Richard's jaw twitched. He didn't know whether disappointment or relief washed through him. And the boys. Robert flipped to another section. Liam and No Carter, 6 years old, fraternal twins, both born at Harborview Medical Center. Guess who signed as their father? He slid 2 birth certificates across the desk. There printed clearly, Father Ethan Hamilton. Richard stared at the names as if they might rearrange themselves into something less explosive. They didn't. He looked up sharply. "Why the hell would Ethan put his name on an official document and never tell me?" "That," Robert said, "is a story that lines up exactly with what the woman told you. I tracked down former coworkers at the cafe where Emily worked. They all remember Ethan. Said he came every morning, asked for her section, sometimes stayed through her breaks. One called them inseparable. Another said they acted married long before the kids came." Richard's mouth tightened. Married. The thought lodged in his throat like a splinter. "There's more," Robert continued. "Neighbors from the apartment she used to rent said Ethan visited nearly every night after work. One said she often heard him reading stories through the thin walls. And look at this." He handed over a bundle of photographs, all candid, all unmistakably real. Ethan holding 2 toddlers in a public park. Ethan pushing a stroller. Ethan laughing with Emily as the boys splashed each other at a fountain. Ethan wearing an apron in a tiny apartment kitchen, stirring a pot while one of the twins tugged at his pant leg. Richard felt the first true tremor of grief in years ripple through him, not the grief of loss, but the grief of realizing he had never known his own son. He had never seen this version of Ethan. This man, relaxed, joyful, unburdened, was a stranger. Robert continued carefully. "It gets worse, or better, depends how you look at it. Ethan told multiple people that he wanted to tell you about the twins. He even scheduled meetings with your assistant twice. Both times, the meetings got canceled because you flew out early for business. After that, he stopped trying." Richard's breath caught. He could picture it clearly, his son standing outside his office door, rehearsing words that never reached him, words drowned by quarterly priorities and mergers. He forced himself to refocus. "What about Emily's financial situation? You said she was living in a shelter." Robert nodded. "She's been bouncing between shelters for 5 months. Before that, she lived in a low-income apartment until she fell behind on rent. She works multiple jobs but can't keep up with childcare expenses. Several people say she goes without food on days when there isn't enough for the kids." A cold knot formed in Richard's stomach. The idea of Ethan's sons going hungry was enough to ignite a protective fire in him that he didn't fully understand. "She said Ethan visited them every night right up until the accident." "She didn't lie," Robert confirmed. Coworkers, neighbors, even the pediatrician corroborated it. Ethan was there constantly, paid medical bills, bought diapers, showed up at school events before they were old enough to remember. Richard sank back in his chair, the weight of the revelations pressing into him. Ethan had built a life, one filled with love, with children, with responsibilities, and Richard had known nothing. The room felt colder. He looked up sharply. What about the boys? Their schooling, their environment? Underfunded public program. They missed multiple days last month because Emily couldn't get transportation. No consistent health care since the accident, no permanent address. They're at high risk for intervention from child services if the wrong person reports them. Richard's eyes hardened, so they're vulnerable. Very. Robert closed the folder, and Emily knows it. Every interview I conducted painted the same picture. She's trying, but she's drowning. Richard tapped his finger against the desk, his mind already calculating possibilities, risks, advantages. Do the boys show any behavioral issues? Not yet, Robert replied, but stress is visible. The older one, Liam, is protective to an extreme degree. The younger one, no, startles easily. Both cling to her constantly. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing each detail like ammunition. And legally, if I wanted to step in. Robert hesitated. You'd have grounds if you proved she can't provide basic stability. But she's their biological mother. Courts favor mothers unless there's abuse, neglect, or Richard pressed. Or you establish overwhelming capability and question her suitability without directly accusing her. It's a gray area. Richard's mind shifted into the ruthless clarity that had built Hamilton's steel from the ground up. Emily Carter might have been Ethan's partner, but to Richard she represented instability, unpredictability. Those boys deserved more. They deserved Hamilton opportunities, Hamilton education, Hamilton futures. He picked up the birth certificates again, letting the reality sink deeper. His grandsons, the only heirs left to carry the Hamilton name. He would not let them grow up in shelters and public schools. He made his decision. Keep digging, Richard said firmly. Every weakness, every vulnerability, every pattern. I want it all. Robert studied him for a moment. Richard, what exactly are you planning to do? Richard closed the folder and stood, the determination in his expression carving out an entirely new persona, one not just grieving or calculating, but resolute. I'm going to bring my grandsons home, he said, and I will not let anything or anyone stand in the way. Robert swallowed, recognizing a tone that had made COs tremble, and their mother. Richard paused, then slipped Ethan's photograph back into the drawer. She'll get whatever place the law decides she deserves. But he already intended to make sure the law saw what he wanted it to see. And with that, Richard Hamilton set in motion the first step of a plan that would destroy Emily's world long before she understood it had begun. Richard Hamilton spent the next 24 hours in a state of sharpened focus that bordered on obsession. Once the shock faded, his mind settled into the relentless precision that had built his empire, an instinct born from decades of turning threats into opportunities and obstacles into stepping stones. Now the threat was Emily Carter, and the opportunity was the chance to reshape the Hamilton legacy through Ethan's sons. Richard told himself he was acting for the children's benefit, for their futures, for the promise of stability that Emily could never provide. But beneath those neatly layered justifications was something rawer. He could not bear the thought of his grandsons growing up outside his world, outside his control, shaped by a woman who had lived in poverty and obscurity. He believed the boys deserved better, and he believed he was the only one who could deliver it. By early morning, he had already scheduled an appointment with the one attorney he trusted to handle matters requiring precision without consignor, Amanda Pierce. Her name alone carried weight in Seattle's legal circles. She was known for building airtight cases, the kind that strangled opposition before they could even form a strategy. Amanda arrived at his mansion dressed in a charcoal gray suit sharp enough to suggest that the day would be won before it even began. As she walked into his office, she set her leather briefcase on the desk and greeted him with a nod. You said this was urgent, she stated, her voice measured, efficient. Richard wasted no time. He pushed the folder containing Emily's information across the polished oak surface. I need custody of my grandsons, he said, permanently. Amanda flipped open the folder and read with rapid precision. Her eyes narrowed as she noted the shelter address, the unstable employment history, the inconsistent school attendance. This mother is struggling, she observed. That helps. But it won't be enough on its own. Courts default to biological mothers unless there's a reason not to. Richard leaned forward, then find a reason, or build one, legally, ethically, whatever fits within the definition of allowable conduct. Amanda studied him, assessing the weight behind his words. She had represented Richard long enough to know he wanted results, not discussions about morality. Tell me everything, she said. Richard described the encounter at the cemetery, the photograph, the boy's resemblance, Ethan's name on the birth certificates. Amanda listened carefully, tapping her pen against the table. The fact that Ethan acknowledged paternity on official documents gives you standing, she said. You can pursue visitation, involvement, even financial oversight. She paused. but full custody that requires proving Emily unfit or incapable. Richard's jaw tightened. She's living in a shelter. She works multiple jobs. The boys have no reliable home, no stable education, no consistent medical care. Isn't that enough? Amanda shook her head. Judges see struggling mothers every day. They're sympathetic, not punitive. Poverty isn't a crime. You need something stronger, something concrete. Something that suggests she cannot safely care for them. Richard's mind turned with the efficiency of a well-engineered machine. And if such evidence doesn't exist? Amanda closed the folder and met his eyes. Then someone would have to create it. The words hung heavy between them. Richard didn't flinch. Do it, he said. Amanda's expression remained neutral, but there was a calculating gleam in her eyes. I'll begin the paperwork for a petition to request emergency visitation rights. It will give us access to the boys and to her environment. Meanwhile, I'll need someone to document any potential risks around her. Richard already had someone in mind. I'll handle that part. Amanda gathered her things. Then we proceed on two fronts. We build a narrative of instability, and we create supporting evidence if necessary. If Child Protective Services gets involved, we position you as the stable alternative. Once they re in your custody temporarily, we make it permanent. When she left, Richard felt the first clean lines of a plan crystallize. He was moving. And once he began moving, nothing stopped him. That afternoon, he made another call, this time to a man whose work never appeared on invoices or legal documents. If Robert Alvarez was Richard's investigator, Mason Doyle was his shadow operator. Mason had done things for Richard that could never be spoken aloud: discreet surveillance, damage control, strategic persuasion, influence where influence needed applying. Richard rarely needed him, but when he did, outcomes shifted in his favor. Mason arrived at dusk, stepping into the mansion through the side entrance. He was tall, lean, with the kind of face that could blend into any crowd, the kind that left no impression unless he wanted to. He didn't bother sitting. "You've got a job?" he asked, hands in his pockets. Richard nodded. "A woman named Emily Carter." He explained everything with clinical detail: Ethan, the twins, the shelter, the need for leverage. Mason listened without judgment. "And what exactly do you want from her?" he asked. "I want her documented as unstable," Richard replied, "irresponsible, living in unsafe conditions. Anything that raises concerns about her ability to parent." Mason tilted his head. "You want real concerns or manufactured ones?" Richard didn't blink. "Whatever serves the objective." Mason nodded slowly. "I'll observe her first. If there's nothing substantial, I'll create opportunity, something subtle. Something hard to disprove: a missed pickup, a neighbor complaint, an incident at work. Something that paints her as negligent without making her look malicious." Richard exhaled, a mixture of relief and tension curling through his ribs. "Do it carefully. She's the mother of my grandsons. I don't want chaos, just proof." Mason understood the subtext: destroy her credibility, not her life. That night, long after Mason left, Richard stood at his study window overlooking the lake. He watched the dark water ripple under the moon's reflection, and the quiet landscape seemed to stretch endlessly. He no longer felt conflicted. After days of emotional turmoil, a chilling clarity had finally settled inside him. Ethan's sons were Hamiltons, and he would not allow fate nor a struggling young mother to determine their future. Emily had made choices that placed her in poverty, instability, and hardship. Richard believed she had also made choices that kept Ethan from him. Now those choices would cost her something far greater. The law would see what he needed it to see. The courts would hear the narrative he needed them to hear. And when this was over, Liam and Noah would live in the world Ethan should have given them, the world Richard intended to give them now. He picked up the photograph of Ethan once more. He studied the joy in his son's face, the life Ethan had chosen without him, the family he had built beyond Richard's reach. "I'm doing this for you," he murmured under his breath, though he wasn't sure whether he believed it. But he believed this: he would win. He always did. And Emily Carter, already exhausted, already one step from collapse, would never see the storm coming. For the next several days, Mason Doyle moved like a shadow through the city, tracking Emily Carter with the kind of precision that made him indispensable to a man like Richard Hamilton. He watched her routine unfold with grim predictability. She woke before dawn at the shelter, helped her sons get dressed in clothes too thin for Seattle mornings, hurried them onto a crowded bus, dropped them at a low-budget childcare program, then hurried to one of her multiple jobs where she scrubbed floors, wiped tables, or lifted crates far too heavy for her slight frame. She lived in a loop of struggle, exhaustion, and sacrifice. To Mason, the pattern was a blueprint waiting to be exploited. For Richard, this surveillance was exactly what he expected: evidence of instability, hardship, and vulnerability. But what neither of them anticipated was how tirelessly Emily fought to hold her deteriorating world together. Mason kept his distance, blending into backgrounds effortlessly. His clothing was neutral, his expressions forgettable, his presence engineered to go unnoticed. He followed Emily onto buses, into corner stores, through back hallways of the company she cleaned. He saw the way she checked her phone every few minutes, hoping for a job offer or waiting for a call from the shelter. He saw the way she kept her son's clothes whenever she picked them up, bending down to kiss their hair with a tenderness that Mason found inconveniently human. He wasn't being paid to empathize. He was being paid to find weakness or create it. Despite her exhaustion, Emily rarely slipped. She handled the children with patience, kept her small workspace organized, and avoided conflict even when provoked. But Mason knew that no one living in her situation could maintain that level of composure forever. People under pressure cracked eventually, and he would be there the moment she did. One cold Thursday afternoon, he finally spotted the first opportunity. Emily arrived late to her shift at the downtown cafe where she worked evenings. A bus delay had cost her precious minutes, and by the time she pushed through the back door, hair frizzed from rain, coat soaked, breath, and even her manager was waiting with crossed arms and visible irritation. Mason watched from a nearby booth as the man hissed reprimands at her, jabbing a finger toward the time clock. Emily bowed her head and apologized repeatedly, her voice strained but steady. Her manager eventually stormed off, leaving her to tie her apron around her waist with shaking hands. Mason didn't intervene yet, but he filed the moment away. A pattern of tardiness would paint the narrative Richard needed. He followed her through the evening, noting the fatigue in her movements as she wiped down tables and delivered orders. Every misstep, every moment she nearly dropped a glass or forgot an order, became ammunition in his mind. And when the cafe closed, he followed her again through the wet streets toward the dimly lit bus stop where she waited alone, rubbing her arms against the cold. Mason watched from across the street, blending into the flow of pedestrian traffic. He wasn't interested in her dignity, only her vulnerability. By the weekend, he had amassed a list of minor lapses: lateness, exhaustion, mistakes at work, a heated exchange with another employee, but none of it was substantial enough to threaten custody in court. He needed something bigger, something undeniable. Something that would turn Emily from a sympathetic, struggling mother into a woman the court saw as fundamentally unreliable. So he shifted from observation to engineering. On Monday morning, Mason followed Emily onto the bus carrying her sons to the child care center. The vehicle was crowded, noisy, jostling with commuters. Emily sat with Lime and Noah on her lap, trying to keep them calm. When the bus lurched forward suddenly, one of the boys nearly fell. Emily caught him, but the moment of panic left her visibly shaken. Mason took notes. As the bus neared the stop, he moved closer, positioning himself behind them. When Emily stepped off, balancing her sons and her bag, Mason walked intentionally close enough to bump her elbow, causing her bag to slip to the ground. Papers scattered across the wet pavement. Emily bent frantically to collect them while the bus pulled away. Two passersby helped her gather the documents. She thanked them breathlessly, unaware that Mason was already recording the scene from a discreet angle that made the mishap appear chaotic and careless. The footage would be easily misinterpreted: Emily losing control, children nearly stepping into the street, strangers picking up her belongings. Mason wasn't creating danger, he was capturing suggestion, and suggestion was often more powerful than proof. That afternoon, he visited the child care center posing as a social worker conducting routine community assessments. His badge was forged but flawless. He spoke politely with the front desk staff, complimented their facility, asked questions about children's attendance patterns. From the conversation, he learned that Emily had missed 2 payments and that the boys had arrived late several times. The woman at the desk mentioned it casually, not knowing her words would be weaponized. Mason left the building satisfied. The narrative was forming: unstable mother, inconsistent childcare, financial hardship, unsafe routines. But he needed one more piece, something that showed Emily failing at home. The shelter presented the perfect environment. He waited until nightfall and slipped inside under the guise of a volunteer. Shelters were chaotic, filled with movement, distraction, and exhaustion. No one noticed him blend in. He wandered the halls calmly, observing the cramped rooms where families slept on metal bunks. He found Emily's room easily. It had her name on a taped piece of paper beside the doorframe. Inside, the boys were already asleep, curled under mismatched blankets. Emily sat on the lower bunk writing in a battered notebook, her face illuminated by the faint glow of a small lamp. Mason lingered in the doorway, pretending to organize supplies. She didn't notice him. She was too focused on the notebook, one of the many letters she wrote to her sons, a habit she had maintained since their birth. Letters they never received. It would have been simple to stage something here: leave medicine open on a counter, knock over a lamp, create the appearance of hazard, but he resisted. If the scene felt too contrived, a judge might question it. Instead, he waited for a more organic opportunity. It came the next night when Emily stumbled in after a 14-hour day drained beyond functioning. She set her bag down and forgot to latch the window above the bunk beds. The wind rattled it open slightly during the night. Mason noticed from the hallway. In the morning, one of the shelter volunteers scolded Emily, concerned that the cold draft had made the children uncomfortable. Mason didn't intervene. He simply logged the incident negligence through exhaustion. By the end of the week, he had built what he needed: footage of chaos, notes from childcare, missed payments, workplace conflict, shelter instability, environmental hazards, and moments of parental lapse. None of these things alone were damning, but woven together by a skilled attorney like Amanda Pierce, they could form a compelling story, a story that framed Emily as loving but unfit, overwhelmed, incapable of providing the structure two young boys needed. Mason compiled everything into a clean folder, then texted Richard a simple message: "It's done." Richard didn't reply immediately, but when he did, the message was short and definitive. "Bring it to me, tomorrow." Tomorrow, Emily Carter's life would begin to crumble. Richard Hamilton woke before dawn, sharper and more focused than he had felt since Ethan died. He didn't eat breakfast, didn't check emails, didn't glance at the market reports laid neatly on his kitchen counter. None of those held meaning today. Today was the day he would reclaim what he believed belonged to him: his grandsons, his bloodline, the legacy that Ethan took from him in life and hid from him in death. When Mason arrived at the mansion at 8 sharp, Richard was already waiting in his study, the heavy curtains half drawn, the morning light slanting across the glossy wooden floor. Mason placed a thick envelope on the desk and stepped back. Richard opened it slowly, methodically, as if he were reviewing financial statements rather than the dismantling of a woman's life. Inside were photographs, timestamps, documented observations, fabricated implications woven seamlessly with truth. It was exactly what he needed. Not outright lies; those were too risky. Instead, subtle manipulations crafted to make Emily appear overwhelmed, negligent, incapable of sustaining her children's well-being. Proof without actually proving anything, evidence built from the spaces between facts. Richard examined every photo in detail. Emily tripping on the bus step, papers scattered across the ground, the boys looking frightened. Emily arriving late to work, manager scolding her. Emily standing outside the shelter with her hair disheveled, her face pale with exhaustion. The open window above the children's bed, blankets blown askew. Each moment individually was forgivable. But together, through the lens of a courtroom, it painted a picture of chaos, a picture of instability, a picture that made Richard feel justified in everything he had done and everything he would do next. "This will be enough," Richard said calmly. Mason nodded. "I made sure nothing appears staged. It all looks like a pattern of someone who's struggling beyond her limits." Richard tucked the envelope into a leather folder and dismissed him with a curt nod. Mason left without another word, fading from the mansion as quietly as he had arrived. Richard didn't watch him go. His mind had already moved on to the next phase. 2 hours later, he met with Amanda Pierce at her downtown office. The building towered over Seattle's financial district, a facade of reflective glass and steel fitting for the kind of law she practiced, sleek in appearance, brutal in function. Amanda closed her office door behind them and gestured toward a seat. "Did Doyle deliver?" she asked. Richard handed her the folder. She flipped through the contents carefully, her expression cool and analytical. "This is exactly what we need," she said. "Nothing too extreme. Nothing unbelievable. Just a continuous pattern of instability." Richard leaned back in the chair. "How do we use it?" Amanda folded her hands. "First, we file for emergency visitation under the argument that the children have a right to know their paternal family and that you were only recently made aware of their existence. Given your status, the court will accommodate quickly. Once visitation is granted, we request a home inspection of Emily's living conditions. With these documents," she tapped the folder, "we will raise concerns about safety and stability. That will trigger an evaluation from CPS." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "Child services." "Yes," Amanda continued, "it's the fastest path to temporary custody. If the environment is deemed unsafe or unstable, CPS will act. And once the boys are placed with you, even temporarily, Emily will have to fight uphill to get them back. Most parents in her position don't win." Richard absorbed her words with a cold satisfaction. He didn't feel guilty. He felt purposeful, focused. Ethan's sons needed him. He was giving them a life Emily could never offer. Amanda tapped her pen lightly against her desk. "There's one more thing. Judges don't act on paperwork alone. They rely heavily on perception. Emily needs to look overwhelmed, defensive, disorganized during the hearing. If she appears too composed, too stable, it undermines our argument." Richard nodded. "She will be overwhelmed. How can you be so sure?" Amanda asked. Richard's voice lowered. "She's already on the edge. All it will take is one more push." Amanda didn't press further. She knew better than to question the methods behind Richard's confidence. That evening, Richard sat alone in his study, reviewing the visitation request Amanda had drafted. The wording was strategic, measured, sympathetic, and manipulative. It framed him not as an aggressor but as a grieving grandfather seeking connection to the last pieces of his son. He was painted as compassionate, concerned, responsible. Emily, in contrast, was subtly described as precarious, overwhelmed, and inconsistent. The petition would be filed the next morning. In 48 hours, the court would set a hearing. In less than a week, Cease would be involved. Everything was moving according to plan. But as Richard read the document, his eyes drifted to the picture of Ethan he kept on the lower shelf. The smile, the lightness, the warmth. Ethan had built a family without him, had loved them deeply. For a moment, a brief, fleeting moment, Richard felt something twist sharply beneath his ribs. Was this what Ethan would have wanted? Would he want his sons ripped away from the woman who had loved him, who had raised their children alone? But Richard swallowed the doubt as soon as it rose. Ethan had made reckless decisions. Ethan had kept secrets. Ethan had left his children vulnerable. Richard would not make the same mistake. He told himself that over and over. He wrapped himself in it like armor. He stood, straightened his jacket, and set the visitation petition on top of his desk. The decision was final, the path was chosen. And when he lay down that night, he slept with the certainty of a man convinced he was doing the right thing, unaware of the devastation already rolling toward Emily Carter like an unstoppable tide. Emily Carter woke before the sun rose, as she always did, her body conditioned by necessity rather than choice. She blinked at the dim light seeping through the cracks of the shelter window and forced her aching limbs to move before exhaustion convinced her to stay still. Liam and No slept curled against her sides, small bodies breathing in soft rhythms, their faces peaceful only in sleep. Emily brushed their hair back gently, savoring the moment before the day clawed at her again. She didn't know that in another part of the city, a petition had already been filed with her name on it, one that would dismantle everything she had fought to keep intact. She dressed quickly, changed the boys, gathered their worn backpacks, and walked them through the narrow hallways of the shelter. They greeted volunteers, waved at familiar residents, and stepped out into the icy Seattle morning. The wind cut at Emily's skin as she hurried toward the bus stop, holding both boys' hands tightly. She prayed the route wouldn't be delayed today, not with her warning at the CAF looming over her head. She couldn't afford to lose another job. She couldn't afford anything except survival. But the bus was 10 minutes late, then 20. By the time it arrived, Emily felt anxiety pulsing in her throat, squeezing her breath as she ushered the boys on board. She sat between them, checking her phone repeatedly for the time, whispering encouragements even as her pulse raced. They reached the chilled care center nearly 30 minutes past the usual drop-off, and though the staff offered her a sympathetic look, Emily could feel disapproval simmering beneath it. She apologized like she always did, sincerely, desperately, habitually. Then she rushed toward the CAF with aching legs and damp palms, silently rehearsing the same excuse she'd used too many times. She didn't notice the black SUV parked across the street. She didn't recognize the man inside it. She didn't know who he worked for. She didn't know her lateness was no longer an innocent struggle, it was evidence. Inside the CAF, her manager barely contained his irritation. "Emily, you can't keep coming in late," he snapped. "I'm running a business, not a daycare charity." Emily apologized again, explaining the bus delays, the cold, the distance, the uncontrollable obstacles of poverty. He waved her off and told her to get to work, though she could tell she was one more slip away from losing the job entirely. She spent the next 9 hours wiping tables, carrying trays that strained her wrists, being rushed, scolded, or ignored. Her feet throbbed. Her back burned. She missed her sons. She wondered how much longer she could keep all of this together. By late afternoon, she still had another shift to go, her cleaning job at a high-rise office building downtown. She retrieved Liam and No, gathered their things, and hurried toward the next bus. She fed them half sandwiches she had saved from the CAF, apologizing for the limited meal even though they never complained. They were good kids, too good, she often thought, because they already understood hunger, sacrifice, and hardship far beyond their years. As Emily cleaned offices on the 27th floor that evening, the boys sat quietly in a corner with crayons provided by a kind receptionist. Emily kept glancing at them, terrified someone might report her for bringing children into a workspace, but she had no choice. She couldn't leave them alone at the shelter. She couldn't miss her shift. She was held together by desperation, a fragile stitching that threatened to tear each time her life tugged too hard. She didn't know a peace worker would soon ask why her sons were in an office building at night. She didn't know those crayons would become part of a case file. She didn't know someone was watching through a lens, capturing her struggle in angles that made it look like neglect. By the time she returned to the shelter that night, carrying both boys half asleep in her arms, her entire body felt hollowed out. She set them on the bed, removed their shoes, kissed their cheeks, and whispered promises about a better future she no longer knew how to create. She sat on the lower bunk and pulled out her notebook, writing another letter she would never send. Liam, no, I'm trying. I hope one day you'll know that. The next morning, everything began to unravel. A knock came just as she finished tying Noah's shoelaces. She opened the door expecting a volunteer or another resident. Instead, a woman with a badge stood there, tall, professional, wearing a calm expression that instantly made Emily's stomach twist. Ms. Carter? She asked. My name is Dana. I'm with Child Protective Services. We received a report and we'd like to discuss some concerns. Emily's throat closed. Concerns about what? The boys clung to her legs, sensing tension in the air. If you don't mind, Dana said gently, I'd like to take a look around and ask you a few questions. Emily stepped aside, trembling. She didn't think she had anything to hide, but the very presence of space felt like a verdict already forming. Dana looked through the room at the thin blankets, the backpack with broken zippers, the cracked window that Emily hadn't realized had blown open during the night. She asked where the boys slept, ate, bathed. She asked about Emily's work schedule. She asked about transportation. She asked about school attendance. The questions started gentle, then they turned sharp. Have the boys ever been left unattended? Have you missed any childcare payments? Do you often arrive late to pick them up? Do you bring them to your workplaces? How often do you rely on the shelter for food? Is there anyone else who helps you? Each question felt like a blade. Each answer felt like surrender. Emily tried to explain everything: poverty, overwork, exhaustion, lack of resources, but the more she explained, the more she realized how damning her own words sounded. The system wasn't built for nuance. It didn't care about love. It cared about checkboxes, stability, perfection, everything Emily didn't have. The boys watched wide-eyed, confused, scared. Liam tried to speak, insisting they'd been fine, insisting their mom took care of them. Noah clung to Emily's shirt and whimpered. Dana made notes. By the time the caseworker left with a polite smile and a promise to follow up soon, Emily felt her world tilting. She sat on the edge of the bed, shaking, hugging both sons as if someone might tear them from her arms at any moment. Her heart hammered. Her palms were cold. She whispered prayers she hadn't said in years. She didn't know CPs had already contacted Amanda Pierce's office. She didn't know the visitation hearing had been scheduled for Monday morning. She didn't know Richard Hamilton had already been notified. She didn't know she would walk into that hearing completely alone while a billionaire with a legal army waited to take her children. All she knew was fear, raw, choking, unfamiliar. The kind of fear that comes when a mother senses danger she can't understand yet but feels in her bones. She held her sons tighter and whispered, I won't let anything happen to you. But the storm was already at her door. The morning of the hearing approached faster than Emily could process. All weekend she felt an invisible clock ticking against her, a countdown she couldn't escape. After the visit from CPs, she barely slept. She lay awake on the shelter mattress with her sons tucked beside her, listening to the hum of traffic outside, the occasional cough from another resident, the creaking of old pipes, every sound reminding her she lived in a world that judged her as unfit before she even stepped into the courtroom. She tried to reassure Liam and Noah, but the boys sensed her fear. They clung to her constantly, asking whether CPs would take them away. Emily forced herself to smile, telling them everything would be fine, but the truth was she didn't believe her own words. By Sunday night, her stomach twisted with dread so tight she could barely breathe. She wasn't prepared for court. She didn't have an attorney. She had no documents proving stability, no lease, no consistent income, no childcare backup. She didn't even have a printer to print anything. She showed up with nothing but love, and she feared love wasn't going to be enough. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. Emily dressed the boys in their cleanest clothes and held their hands tightly as they boarded the bus. The courthouse loomed across the street like an immovable stone fortress, tall columns and reflective windows announcing that wealth and power lived comfortably within its walls. Emily hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of how small she looked: frayed coat, worn shoes, tired face. Liam squeezed her hand and whispered, Mom, it's okay, we're with you. She forced a nod and pushed the door open. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with people, lawyers carrying thick briefcases, officers guiding families, clerks shuffling papers. Everything felt too fast, too loud, too overwhelming. Emily approached the reception desk, her voice barely steady as she gave her name and case number. The clerk's expression softened slightly, but Emily could tell even she assumed the hearing wouldn't go well. Your courtroom is on the 3rd floor, the clerk said. Good luck. When Emily stepped into the assigned courtroom, her breath stopped. On the far side of the room sat Richard Hamilton, immaculate in a tailored navy suit, posture rigid, expression composed. Beside him sat his attorney, a woman with sharp eyes and a stack of organized folders. Emily recognized instantly that this was a battle she wasn't equipped for. Richard didn't look at her at first. When he finally did, his expression held no warmth, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. Only a cold resolve that made Emily's knees nearly buckle. She felt Liam squeeze her arm, grounding her. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Emily held her boys close, wishing she had anyone on her side. The hearing began. The judge reviewed the documents, flipping through pages filled with statements, reports, and photographs that Emily hadn't known existed. She tried to see what he was reading, but from where she stood, everything was a blur. She watched the judge raise his eyebrows at certain lines, undoubtedly the ones that painted her as unstable. Amanda Pierce stood and began presenting Richard's petition. Her voice was smooth, respectful, perfectly practiced. She spoke of tragedy, first of Ethan's death, of Richard's grief, of the discovery of 2 grandchildren he had never known existed. She framed Richard as a man who simply wanted to connect with his son's legacy, who wished to provide support and stability to 2 children who had tragically begun life in hardship. Then came the pivot, the subtle shift that recast Emily's world into a narrative of danger. Amanda detailed Emily's living conditions, the shelter, the inconsistent childcare, the late pickups, the difficulty paying fees. She referenced the SEEP's viz as if it were proof of long-term concern rather than a call triggered by engineered events. She described Emily's multiple jobs as unsustainable, her transportation struggles as risk factors, and her exhaustion as clear indicators of an overwhelmed caregiver. She never called Emily a bad mother. She didn't need to. The implication bled through every polished sentence. Then came the photographs. The moment they were projected onto the screen, Emily felt as if her soul cracked. She saw herself tripping on the bus step, her sons looking frightened, her bag spilled across the pavement. She saw the late arrival to childcare, her manager scolding her, the open window at the shelter. Each image was real yet twisted into a weapon. She opened her mouth to explain that wasn't what it looked like, but the judge raised a hand for her to stay quiet. When the judge finally turned to her and asked whether she wanted to respond, Emily felt her heart pound so violently she could barely form words. She tried to explain the realities of poverty, the unpredictability of buses, the lack of childcare options, the exhaustion of working 2 jobs. She tried to say she loved her sons more than anything, that she was doing her best, that none of those photos showed neglect, only hardship. But her voice shook, she stumbled over her sentences. She felt judged before she spoke. She sounded defensive. She sounded desperate. She sounded exactly like the unstable mother Amanda had portrayed. Richard watched, stoic, unmoved. To him this was necessary. To Emily it was devastating. The judge reviewed both sides quietly for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and neutral, carrying the weight of authority that broke Emily's world. Given the concerns raised, and considering the children's right to know their paternal family, the court will grant Mr. Hamilton temporary visitation rights effective immediately. Emily felt her breath catch. Temporary visitation, she could handle that maybe. Then the judge continued. Additionally, due to documented instability in the home environment, Child Protective Services is instructed to conduct a full evaluation. During this evaluation, temporary custody will be shared between Ms. Carter and Mr. Hamilton. The children will spend half the week in Ms. Hamilton's residence. Emily's knees weakened. Liam and Noah clung to her. She shook her head repeatedly. Your Honor, please, please, this will confuse them. They've never been away from me. They don't even know him. But the judge had already moved on to the next case file. The decision was final. A bailiff approached, gently reminding her to accompany the children downstairs to meet the CP's representative who would coordinate the transition schedule. Richard stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and finally looked at Emily with a soft expression meant to appear compassionate. It didn't reach his eyes. This is for the boys, he said quietly. They deserve stability. Emily stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak. They deserve their mother, she whispered. But Richard turned away before the words reached him. Within an hour, Emily walked out of the courthouse with her sons holding her hands, tears collecting in her eyes as a CP's worker outlined a visitation plan she never agreed to. Liam looked up at her with confusion and fear. Mom, are we going with him? Emily forced a trembling smile. Not today, she whispered. But soon, her world had cracked open, and she knew deep down that this was only the beginning of the fight. A fight she never asked for, but one she would have to survive. The first night of the shared custody order arrived faster than Emily could emotionally prepare for. She spent the whole day trying to steady her nerves, clinging to a sense of normalcy that kept slipping through her hands. CPs had instructed her to have the boys ready by 6 o'clock for the scheduled pickup. The shelter felt unusually tense as she packed their small backpacks, 2 sets of pajamas, toothbrushes, their favorite stuffed animals, the hand-drawn pictures they insisted on bringing in case Grandpa didn't have any art on his walls. Emily forced a smile at that, though her chest tightened painfully every time she imagined the boys inside Richard Hamilton's mansion, surrounded by a life she couldn't compete with. She hated that the system had put her in this position. She hated that money, lawyers, and fabricated evidence had carried more weight than love. Most of all, she hated that she had to hand over her children to a man who had orchestrated the very circumstances now being used against her. By 5:30, Liam and No stood near the shelter entrance wearing their small jackets and clutching the toys they refused to leave behind. They looked excited and nervous, the way children do when stepping into something unfamiliar. "Mom," Liam asked softly, "do we have to go?" Emily knelt in front of him, brushing his hair back. "Just for a little while," she said. "And I'll be right here when you come back. I promise." No grabbed her neck and hugged her tightly, burying his face against her. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, trying to memorize the warmth of his little arms, the smell of their shampoo, the weight of their trust. She didn't know how many more nights she'd get like this. When the clock hit 6, a black luxury car pulled up outside the shelter, spotless and imposing amid the cracked sidewalks and flickering streetlights. The doors opened with a smooth mechanical click, and Richard stepped out dressed in a charcoal suit even though it was after work hours. A woman from Seek stood beside him, clipboard in hand, her demeanor firm but cordial. "Ms. Carter," she greeted, "we here for the boys." Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. She nodded mechanically, knowing that refusal would only make things worse. But when Richard approached her, his expression reserved and composed, something inside her twisted. He didn't look like a man stealing her children. He looked like a man accepting something entitled to him. That made it worse. She forced herself to speak. "Please just take care of them. They've never been away from me overnight. They get scared." Richard's reply was calm and polished, almost rehearsed. "I will make sure they're comfortable. They'll be safe." Emily heard the words but didn't believe them. She didn't know if he meant comfortable in a physical sense or if he intended to reshape them into Hamilton hairs, molding them away from her influence. Liam hesitated before stepping toward him, glancing at Emily for reassurance. She gave a shaky nod, placing a gentle hand on his back. No followed, reluctant and teary-eyed. "Mommy, come with us," he begged. Emily's throat tightened as she crouched and kissed both their foreheads. "I will see you tomorrow," she whispered. "Be brave for me." The piece worker guided the boys to the car. No cried when the door closed. Liam pressed his hand to the window, watching Emily until the car pulled away and his face disappeared from view. The moment they were gone, Emily felt her entire body collapse. She leaned against the shelter wall, hands trembling violently. A volunteer came to ask if she was okay, but she could only nod weakly. She felt like a part of her soul had been ripped out. Richard's perspective was entirely different. Inside the car, he sat across from the boys with a carefully curated gentleness, aware that this was a pivotal moment. The children were quiet at first, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar space and soft leather seats. Richard tried small talk. "Did you have a good day? Are you hungry? Do you like pizza?" But they answered in short, nervous murmurs. He didn't push. He knew first impressions mattered. He wanted them to see him as steady, reliable, confident. Someone they could trust, someone they could eventually prefer. As the car crossed the bridge toward Mercer Island, the city skyline faded behind them and the lake stretched wide beneath the setting sun. Richard watched the boys' expressions shift from fear to awe when the mansion came into view, a sprawling modern structure of glass, stone, and soft golden lighting. It stood in stark contrast to the shelter's cramped walls and flickering bulbs. When the car stopped, the front door opened automatically, and a housekeeper greeted them with a warm smile. Richard gestured calmly. "This is your home too now, at least part of it." The boys clung to each other at first, unsure whether they were allowed to step inside such a pristine place. Richard softened his voice. "Go ahead, you're welcome here." No took the first cautious step. Liam followed, his eyes darting across the gleaming floors, the high ceilings, the massive windows overlooking the water. The mansion felt unreal, like stepping into a world designed from dreams they never had the luxury to imagine. Richard led them upstairs to a room he had ordered furnished earlier that day, twin beds with soft blankets, shelves filled with toys and books, a rug shaped like a racetrack. The room looked warm and inviting, but the boys lingered in the doorway as though afraid it wasn't meant for them. "You don't like it?" Richard asked, masking his tension. Liam shook his head. "It's nice," he said quietly. "But can we sleep with the lights on?" Richard nodded without hesitation, of course. No held his stuffed bear tightly. "Does Mommy know where we are?" Richard crouched down, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, she knows, and she will see you tomorrow." It wasn't a lie, but it was a reassurance designed to keep them calm. He wasn't ready to mention the custody process, the evaluations, the long-term plan. That would come later, once the children grew accustomed to this life. While the boys explored the room timidly, Richard stood in the hallway watching them. He felt something unfamiliar, a tug of protectiveness mixed with vindication. He was certain they belonged here, they looked right here. They fit into the space with a naturalness that fed his conviction that he was doing the right thing. Downstairs he poured himself a drink, the amber liquid reflecting the glow of the chandelier. He didn't feel triumphant exactly, but he felt solid, purposeful. This, he believed, was the beginning of something necessary. Meanwhile, across the city, Emily sat on the lower bunk in the shelter, clutching the small blanket Noah had accidentally left behind. She rocked slightly, trying to steady her breath as tears streamed down her face. Every sound in the shelter felt sharper tonight, every echo heavier, every moment colder. She told herself they were safe. She told herself they'd be back tomorrow. But a deeper fear rooted inside her, the fear that she was losing them piece by piece, night by night, court order by court order. And she didn't know how much more she could lose before she shattered entirely. The next several days unfolded like a slow unraveling of everything Emily had held together for years. Liam and Noah were now spending half the week at Richard's mansion and half with her at the shelter, and each handoff carved a fresh wound inside her chest. She tried to maintain a brave face for the boys, smiling when they left, overcompensating with affection when they returned, pretending that nothing had changed when in reality everything had shifted under her feet. Each time she waited outside the shelter for Richard's car to pull up, her heart thudded with dread. Some days the boys looked excited to see her, running into her arms with the enthusiasm she depended on to stay sane. Other days they stepped out of the car slower, quieter, distracted by the luxury they were leaving behind: new toys, soft blankets, warm meals, spacious rooms, a world she could not compete with. Those days hurt the most. Richard, meanwhile, monitored every interaction with calculated precision. He made sure the handoffs were cordial, never warm, never hostile, only polished. He greeted the boys with the same steady tone and rehearsed patience, offering them stability she could not match. The more comfortable they became around him, the more resolved he grew. He watched them adapt to a structured schedule, nutritious meals, bedtime routines, private tutors, and a home of immaculate order. And each time the boys showed signs of settling in, no asking for the soft blanket at the mansion, Liam requesting the blueberry pancakes, Richard's chef-made, Richard saw it as confirmation that his presence was not only justified but necessary. Emily noticed the changes immediately. The first night they returned, Liam mentioned the housekeeper who helped them pick out pajamas. No talked about the big window that overlooked the lake, how he could see boats at night. Emily responded with forced enthusiasm, but the ache inside her was impossible to hide. She didn't want them to feel guilty. She wanted them to feel loved, but she also feared they were slipping away. When she tucked them into their narrow shelter beds, they asked if they could leave a light on like Grandpa lets them. Emily felt her heart fracture. She nodded and left the small lamp glowing, watching their faces in the warm yellow light, trying to memorize every breath. When they fell asleep, she sat on the floor and cried quietly into her hands. Each day that followed revealed another layer of distance forming in places she couldn't reach. Liam became more curious about Richard's world, asking questions about his father Ethan, looking at the old photo Emily kept, asking why they had never met their grandfather before. Emily answered as gently as she could, saying it was complicated, sweetheart, avoiding the bitter truth that Richard had never wanted to know they existed. Noah, on the other hand, seemed torn, afraid to upset Emily, afraid to upset Richard, caught in the emotional tug of war that neither adult could fully hide. He cried more often at night, waking from dreams he couldn't explain. Emily held him until he slept again, wondering if she was losing both sons or only pieces of them. At the mansion, Richard observed all of this with the cool detachment of a strategist tracking progress. The boys were bonding with him, even if slowly. He had staff take notes how they behave, what foods they preferred, what fears they expressed. He reviewed everything. He met with Amanda twice that week to discuss the ongoing custody case. The court is responding well to the narrative, she reported. Species flagged multiple concerns. They're redocumenting every inconsistency. Richard simply nodded, though a flicker of satisfaction crossed his eyes. Keep it moving, he said. Emily had no idea any of this was happening. She was too busy drowning in practical realities, working extra shifts to prove stability, searching for better housing she couldn't afford, trying to show she could provide structure. But every effort felt swallowed by a system already tilted against her. One afternoon, after a 12-hour double shift, she rushed to the childcare center only to discover she was 20 minutes late for pickup. The boys were fine, but the staff documented it. It was procedure, it was also ammunition. The next day, she visited a low-income housing office hoping to apply for subsidized apartments. The waiting list was 14 months long. She begged the woman behind the desk, explaining her situation, explaining the custody evaluation, explaining her desperation. The woman offered sympathy but no solution. "There's nothing immediate available," she repeated, apologetic but firm. Emily walked out with tears stinging her eyes, gripping the strap of her bag so tightly her knuckles ached. She knew the court would see her living conditions as failure, not circumstance. Later that afternoon, Spies conducted their second visit. Dana arrived with a clipboard and a polite smile that felt colder this time. She asked questions about discipline, about daily routines, about meal planning. Emily tried to answer confidently, but fatigue made her voice uneven. The boys clung to her legs, confused by the repeated questioning. Liam asked, "Are we in trouble?" Emily told him no, but her heart twisted violently because she didn't know if that was true. When Dana left, she reassured Emily she would submit her updated notes to the court. Emily read between the lines. She felt the walls closing in. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Richard arranged a meeting with a child psychologist, one of the best in the region. The psychologist spoke with the boys in a comfortable room scented with lavender and filled with toys. The assessment was meant to appear neutral, but Richard had already framed the children's recent stress as the result of environmental instability. The psychologist listened with concern, then observed the boys playing. Noah was quiet, nervous. Liam was hesitant to mention the shelter but eventually admitted it feels scary sometimes. That was all it took. The psychologist's written report later described signs of anxiety linked to inconsistent living arrangements. Richard forwarded the report to Amanda that evening. When Emily saw the boys the next day, she immediately sensed something different. They were quieter, subdued. Liam hugged her tightly but didn't speak at first. Noah tucked his face into her neck. Emily carried them inside the shelter room and sat on the bunk bed with them. "What's wrong?" she whispered. Liam hesitated. "A lady talked to us," he said. "She asked where we sleep and where we eat and if we ever get scared." Emily felt her blood run cold. "Did you tell her the truth?" Liam nodded. "I told her I get scared sometimes when the pipes make noise. But I said you always make us feel safe." Emily's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. She kissed his forehead, hugged Noah closer, whispered that they did nothing wrong. But deep inside, dread tightened like a fist. She wasn't just fighting a custody case. She was fighting a narrative she couldn't control. Richard had resources, lawyers, experts. She had nothing but love and the painful realization that love might not be enough to save her family. That night, when the boys fell asleep pressed against her sides, Emily stared at the ceiling and made herself a promise through clenched teeth. She would not lose her sons. She would fight until she had no strength left. But she also knew terrifyingly that the ground beneath her feet was already slipping, and Richard Hamilton intended to make sure she never stood firm again. The custody evaluation progressed with an intensity Emily had never experienced before, swallowing every waking hour she had left outside work. Cease insisted she complete a parenting class, attend weekly check-ins, and provide proof of job stability, all while still juggling double shifts, childcare challenges, and the emotional strain of losing her sons half the week. Every requirement felt carefully designed to expose her exhaustion, not support her. And every time she walked into the CP's office, she felt more like a defendant on trial than a mother seeking fairness. Yet she forced herself to show up, to answer every question, to cling to the hope that if she tried hard enough, anyone would notice she was fighting alone. The boys, meanwhile, were slowly being absorbed into the rhythm of Richard's home. They came back with new habits, new words, new behaviors. Liam began asking questions about private schools and extracurricular programs he didn't have access to before. Noah spoke less, choosing to withdraw slightly when he was confused or overwhelmed, something Emily noticed immediately but couldn't fix in the limited time she had with them. When she asked them to tell her about their days at the mansion, their stories were filled with details she didn't know how to process: chefs cooking their favorite meals, tutors teaching them chess, rooms large enough to echo toys they'd never asked for but couldn't hide their fascination with. Emily wanted to be happy for them, wanted to feel grateful they were experiencing things she could never provide. But each new detail felt like a rope tightening around her chest, reminding her that she was being outpaced by a world built on wealth and power. And each time the boys returned quieter or more thoughtful or more conflicted, it broke her further. One evening, after the boys had left for their scheduled overnight in Mercer Island, Emily walked the cold streets of downtown Seattle alone, unable to return to the shelter yet. The city buzzed around her cars, pedestrians, neon signs flickering, but she felt detached from everything, as if moving through someone else's life. Her phone buzzed with a reminder from Fussie's parenting class, Tuesday 4:30 p.m. attendance mandatory. She closed her eyes, fighting the rising panic. She had a shift from 3 to 6. Missing work meant losing the job. Missing the class meant losing her children. It felt like a trap she couldn't escape. The next morning, while she was cleaning the hallway outside the office suite on the 12th floor, her phone buzzed again. A message from Dana, the space worker. The psychologist's report is complete. Please prepare for the next hearing. I will be in touch. Emily's stomach twisted. She knew the report would only complicate things further. She had no idea that the same report had already been sent to Amanda Pierce's office, and that Amanda was already crafting an argument around every word. At the mansion, the boys sat at the breakfast table eating pancakes shaped like airplanes. Richard watched from the opposite end, analyzing their behavior the way he analyzed stock fluctuations carefully, clinically, with intention behind every observation. When Noah asked if he could bring his new toy car to Emily's place, Richard paused. Maybe leave it here so it doesn't get lost, he said gently. You can play with it whenever you at my house. Noah nodded slowly, uncertain. Liam asked if their mother had ever read books about their father. Richard took a breath before responding. She knew him differently than I did, he said, a carefully crafted half-truth. He wasn't lying. She had known Ethan differently, more intimately, more completely, more truthfully. But Richard would never admit that out loud. Instead, he chose the version that suited the narrative he was building, that Emily had kept Ethan's children from the Hamilton family, and now the family was simply correcting the past. That afternoon, Richard met Amanda in her office again. She had spread multiple documents across the table: piece notes, the psychologist's assessment, visitation logs, childcare attendance records. This is shaping exactly as we planned, Amanda said, tapping her pen along the edges of the files. Emily is trying, yes, but effort isn't the standard. Stability is, consistency is, predictability is. You offer all three. Richard nodded. What's next? Amanda hesitated. The next hearing will determine whether the court will shift temporary custody to youth time while Emily continues her compliance requirements. If we present everything correctly, it's likely. Richard felt a flicker of satisfaction. He tried to hide it, but Amanda noticed. She didn't comment, she simply continued working. Emily, unaware of the meeting, was racing across town trying to fit her life into the demands being forced on her. She arrived at the parenting class 15 minutes late, breathless and apologizing. The instructor gave her a disapproving look but marked her as present. Emily forced herself to focus, taking notes with shaking hands. The class wasn't difficult. It wasn't the content that troubled her, it was the knowledge that she was being judged at every turn. Every late arrival, every missed detail, every exhausted expression seemed like evidence against her. When the class ended, she hurried to pick up the boys from the shelter's temporary childcare program. They ran to her with their usual enthusiasm, but she noticed the difference immediately. They were tired, not physically, but emotionally. Liam rested his head on her shoulder, something he hadn't done in months. Noah held her hand without letting go. A small act that told her he was unsure of something but didn't know how to explain it. That night, Emily made them cheap spaghetti in the shelter's communal kitchen. They ate quietly. The boys had grown used to a chef preparing meals with immaculate presentation, and now they sat at a metal table under fluorescent lights. Noah twirled the noodles without eating much. Emily felt humiliation burning her skin. Is it okay? She asked gently. Noah nodded. It's good, he whispered. But she knew it wasn't the food, it was the contrast. Emily tried to sleep later, but she lay awake staring at the ceiling again, wondering how many more nights she had left with her sons before the court decided she wasn't enough. On the other side of the city, in a mansion bathed in warm lighting, Richard read through the updated custody recommendations. The psychologist's evaluations suggest that the boys might benefit from a more predictable environment with reduced exposure to high-stress conditions. Amanda highlighted the phrase with a bright yellow marker. Richard smiled faintly. Everything was aligning. He didn't consider himself cruel, he considered himself decisive. He believed he was rescuing his grandsons, even if it meant dismantling the life of the woman who had brought them into the world. And Emily, sitting in a shelter room with peeling paint and cold air seeping through the window frame, had no idea that the next hearing would be the one that shattered whatever hope she still clung to. The day of the second major custody hearing arrived with a weight that felt almost suffocating. Unlike the first hearing when Emily had walked in blind, unprepared, and armed with nothing but desperation, this time she arrived trembling with the knowledge of exactly how much she stood to lose. She had spent the entire week rehearsing what she would say, combing through every memory, every detail, every scrap of stability she could present, but nothing felt strong enough. She didn't have proof of a better home. She didn't have a steady work schedule. She didn't have a lawyer. She had only her fear, her truth, and the two small hands she held as she guided Liam and Noah through the courthouse doors. The boys looked nervous but tried to be brave for her. "We here, Mom," Liam whispered, squeezing her fingers gently. "We'll be okay." Emily nodded, but the dread twisting through her chest made it hard to believe anything good could come from today. Inside the courtroom, Richard sat with the calm confidence of a man who already knew the outcome. He wore a dark suit, immaculately pressed, and he didn't look at Emily when she entered. Amanda Pierce, his attorney, organized her notes with methodical precision. She looked like she had slept well, prepared thoroughly, and anticipated every angle of the case. Emily, in contrast, felt like she was walking into an execution she was powerless to stop. When the judge entered, the room shifted into order. Emily held her breath, clutching the strap of her bag so tightly her hand shook. She wished she could hold her boys instead. But the bailiff had asked her to allow them to sit separately for the assessment portion of the hearing. That alone had nearly broken her. The judge reviewed the reports before speaking. Emily watched his eyes move across the pages: the CPEEP's notes, the psychologist's evaluation, the visitation logs, the childcare attendance inconsistencies. Each page felt like a blow aimed directly at her ability as a mother. When Amanda stood to present Richard's case, her words were polished and controlled, designed to paint a picture without ever appearing aggressive. She focused on the children's progress in Richard's home, emphasizing structured routines, emotional stability, improved behavior, and new educational opportunities. She referenced the psychologist report, highlighting phrases like mitigated anxiety and improved emotional regulation when the children stayed at the mansion. Emily felt each phrase stab deeper. Then came the contrast, the subtle but devastating description of Emily's environment. Amanda spoke gently, cautiously, as if trying to appear sympathetic while still constructing a mountain of doubt. She listed Emily's missed class, her inconsistent work hours, the late pickups, the shelter's limitations, the recorded observations from SEEPs about the boys appearing fatigued and overwhelmed after certain days in her care. She never said Emily was unfit. She didn't need to. The narrative did the damage on its own. Emily finally spoke when the judge asked for her response. She tried to explain everything: poverty, transportation failures, the impossibility of juggling 2 jobs with no childcare support. She tried to describe how much she loved her sons, how she had been their only constant, how she had carried them through every hardship with both arms wrapped tightly around them. But her voice shook, her breath caught, and she sounded more like a frightened mother than a credible witness. She could feel Richard's gaze on her the entire time, calm, distant, almost pitying. She hated that most of all. When the judge announced he had reviewed all documents and was ready to rule, Emily's heart felt like it had stopped beating. The courtroom seemed to shrink around her. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. She stared at the judge's expression, searching for any hint of mercy, any crack in the inevitable. But there was none. Given the evidence presented, the judge said, "The court concludes that the children's current living situation does not meet the minimum threshold of stability required." Emily's vision blurred, her breath fractured. She gripped the bench to steady herself. The judge continued, his tone firm but clinical. "Effective immediately, temporary full custody will be awarded to Mr. Hamilton's. Carter will retain supervised visitation rights pending completion of the remaining stability requirements outlined by SPEES." Emily's world collapsed. Her legs nearly gave out. She felt like the floor had been pulled from under her, like gravity had suddenly doubled in weight. Liam gasped. No burst into tears. They ran toward her, and for a moment the courtroom was no longer a courtroom, it was a battlefield where a mother clung to her children as strangers prepared to tear them away. She dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around them, pressing their faces against her chest, sobbing into their hair. "Mommy's right here," she whispered. "I'm right here, I'm not leaving you. I swear I'm not leaving you." A bailiff cleared his throat gently, signaling that the children needed to be escorted to Richard. Emily held them tighter. "Please," she whispered, looking up at the judge, "please don't do this. They were my whole life." Her voice cracked, raw and pleading. The judge's expression remained unmoved. "Ms. Carter, the decision is final. You will have visitation twice a week, supervised until further evaluation." Liam cried harder. No screamed for her. Emily felt her body shaking uncontrollably as CPs gently pried the boys from her arms. They clung to her clothing, sobbing, reaching, calling for her. "Mommy! Mommy, don't let go. Don't let them take us." Emily tried to hold on, but her strength was no match for the officers. When Noah's tiny fingers finally slipped from her grasp, she broke. A sound escaped her, a sound ripped from the deepest part of her soul. A sound she didn't know she was capable of making. Richard stepped forward to take the boy's hands. Liam jerked away from him, crying, "I want Mom. I want my mom." Even Richard flinched at that. Emily pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle the sobs racking through her. Her knees hit the floor again, and she stayed there, unable to move, unable to breathe, watching her entire world being pulled farther and farther from her with every step. Richard lifted the boys gently, whispering calm reassurances as they cried against him. He looked at Emily only once briefly, almost regretfully, but his face remained resolute. He believed he was doing what was right. He believed he was saving them. Emily saw none of that. She saw only the man who had destroyed her life with the force of his power. When the doors closed and her sons disappeared behind them, the room became unbearably cold. Emily remained on the floor, trembling violently, her tears falling unchecked. She didn't care that people were watching. She didn't care that the judge had moved on to the next case. She didn't care about anything except the absence of her son's small hands in hers. The CP's worker approached gently, speaking softly, but Emily heard nothing. Her world was nothing but a hollow echo of loss. She felt like she had been carved open and left empty. The only thought that finally pierced through the haze was one born from devastation, fear, and a fierce, desperate love. She would get her sons back, no matter how impossible it seemed, no matter what it cost her. And for the first time in her life, a spark of something new flickered inside her, not hope, not anger, but something sharper. Resolve. The days following the court's devastating ruling were the darkest Emily had ever known. She woke each morning with the instinct to reach for her sons, only to touch empty blankets. The shelter felt colder, harsher, too quiet without the soft weight of Liam curled against her or no whispering sleepy questions at dawn. Every step she took through the corridors felt heavier. People tried offering sympathetic glances, but none of them understood the ache ripping through her chest. Losing custody wasn't like losing a job or missing a bill deadline. It was like losing air, losing direction, losing the very reason she had endured every hardship. But as suffocating as the grief was, something stronger began to form beneath it, a fire that refused to go out. She would get them back somehow, some way. She spent the next days trying to rebuild herself from the shattered pieces, because collapsing wasn't an option anymore. She showed up at every SPEES meeting early. She begged for extra shifts at work. She applied for housing programs, emailed nonprofit organizations, waited in lines that looped around blocks for community assistance. Every rejection stung. Every "I'm sorry, we can't help right now" chipped at what little hope she had left. But she kept going because the alternative, giving up, was unthinkable. Meanwhile, across the city, life at Richard Hamilton's mansion moved forward with calculated ease. Liam and No now lived in well-organized routines: breakfast at 8, private tutoring at 10, lunch on the terrace, supervised playtime in the indoor recreation room, calm evenings with storybooks read by one of Richard's assistants. Richard made sure everything in their world was pristine: healthy meals, quality sleep, educational enrichment. He believed this environment was healing them, shaping them into stronger, more confident boys, and in many ways it was. But he couldn't see the quiet wounds forming beneath the surface, wounds caused not by luxury, but by absence. Every night, when the mansion grew quiet and the lights dimmed, the boys whispered for their mother. Sometimes they cried softly into their pillows, afraid they had done something wrong. Liam asked repeatedly why they couldn't go home. No carried Emily's photo everywhere, gripping it so tightly the edges bent. Richard tried to comfort them, but no amount of wealth could replace the familiarity of their mother's arms. Still, he convinced himself this temporary hardship was necessary. Painful transition now, better future later. That's how he reasoned it. That's how he slept at night. On the fourth day after the ruling, Emily forced herself to visit the public library to use the free computers. Her hands trembled as she typed phrases like free legal help, pro bono custody lawyer, parents' rights after court ruling. Most resources were limited, already overwhelmed, or required appointments booked weeks in advance. She signed up for all of them anyway. She didn't know when or if anyone would contact her, but hope, thin as it was, kept her from collapsing entirely. That evening, when Emily attended her supervised visitation for the first time, her heart pounded with so much longing it felt painful. The supervised visitation room was a space designed to look comforting: bright rugs, soft furniture, toys scattered around, but to Emily it felt artificial. Staged, like a simulation of motherhood rather than the real thing. When the door opened and the boys ran in, everything else in the world disappeared. She fell to her knees as they crashed into her arms, clinging to her like life preservers. No sobbed immediately, burying his face in her neck. Liam held her so tightly she struggled to breathe. The CP supervisor watched from the corner, clipboard in hand, expression neutral. Emily ignored her completely. She kissed the boys' hair dozens of times, whispering how much she loved them, how proud she was, how she would never stop fighting for them. The boys talked over each other, desperate to tell her everything: the mansion, the food, the toys, the bedtime stories, but every sentence ended with the same question: when can we come home? Emily swallowed the pain. Soon she lied softly, "Mommy's working on it." But the hour flew faster than she expected. When the supervisor announced their time was up, No panicked, clinging to Emily with both arms. Emily felt her chest crack open all over again. She held him as long as she could until the supervisor gently intervened. Liam cried quietly, wiping his face with the sleeve of his little jacket. "Mom, don't let go," he whispered. Emily felt something inside her break. "I'll never stop coming for you," she whispered back. After they were taken away, Emily stood frozen in the visitation room long after it emptied. The smell of her sons lingered in her clothes, and she pressed her face into her sleeves, inhaling deeply, trying to hold on to them. She refused to cry in front of CPs, but the moment she reached the sidewalk outside, she broke down so violently she had to lean against the wall just to stay upright. A volunteer asked if she needed help. She shook her head even though she did. She needed someone. She needed support. She needed justice. But she had none of those things. That night at the shelter, determined desperation turned into action. Emily pulled out her notebook, the one she used to write letters to the boys, and instead of writing to them, she began writing a plan. Housing, job stability, legal assistance, emotional documentation, character references, parenting certificates, everything she needed to regain custody. She wrote until her hand cramped, until her eyes blurred, until exhaustion forced her to lie down. But when she slept, it was the first sleep in days that didn't break her entirely. Because she had a strategy, a direction, a reason to keep breathing. On the other side of the city, Richard stood on his balcony watching the lake shimmer under the moonlight. He had just finished reviewing emails from Amanda and Cease. Everything was progressing smoothly. Every report reflected improvement. Every evaluator noted how well the boys adjusted under his care. He told himself that Emily still had supervised visits, that she hadn't lost them entirely, that she would eventually accept this arrangement. But a small voice, one he rarely acknowledged, whispered that he had gone too far. He ignored it. He turned back toward the quiet mansion where his grandsons slept in comfort, convinced he was doing the right thing. Emily, meanwhile, lay in a narrow shelter bed, convinced she was losing everything. Only one of them was right, and soon the truth would reveal itself in ways neither expected. The weeks that followed became a battle Emily never expected, a fight that tested every part of her strength, her resilience, her sanity. Losing full custody had shattered her, but losing hope would destroy her completely, so she forced herself to rise every morning, even when her lungs felt too heavy to breathe. She woke at dawn, worked every shift she could find, attended every mandated class and counseling session, kept every supervised visitation appointment, and still found time to hunt for housing, for legal help, for any glimmer of support that could tilt the scales back toward her children. She stopped eating regularly. She slept only when her body gave out. But what terrified her most was not exhaustion, it was the fear that the boys would adjust too well without her. And they were adjusting slowly, painfully, inevitably. Each visitation revealed something new, something subtle, something that made Emily's heart sink. Liam talked more about the mansion, about schoolwork his new tutor assigned, about the chess lessons he'd started enjoying. He still hugged her tightly, still whispered, "I miss you." But the spark in his eyes dimmed each time he asked when he'd come home, and Emily still didn't have an answer. No clung to her more, craving the softness he didn't find at Richard's. But even he had begun asking questions she couldn't bear hearing. "Mommy, why do we have two homes? Why can't you come with us? Do you still want us?" Every time he asked, Emily's heart cracked open all over again. She assured him with every breath she had left. But she could see the damage forming, the confusion, the wound Richard's world had created, not because he treated them poorly, but because he treated them well. Too well. Well enough that the boys now lived between two worlds, one on love and sacrifice, the other built on wealth and stability. Emily feared which world they would naturally lean toward, and feared even more that the court would see their preference as proof against her. One afternoon after her visitation, Emily stayed behind in the visitation room long after the boys were taken back to the mansion. She stared at the toys they had used, the small handprints on the table, the half-finished drawing Liam had left behind. She held the drawing to her chest, breathing through the H, wishing she could freeze time. The SPEEP's supervisor approached her gently. "Mems. Carter, are you all right?" Emily nodded, even though she clearly wasn't. The supervisor hesitated before speaking. "I've seen a lot of cases. I know how hard this is. But if you keep doing what you're doing, attending meetings, finishing your programs, showing consistency, there's still a chance." Emily swallowed. "A chance for full custody again." The supervisor didn't answer directly. "A chance," she repeated. "That's all I can promise." Meanwhile, Richard felt the opposite. He felt the case tightening in his favor with each passing day. Amanda updated him constantly, her reports crisp and efficient. The boys were thriving, their routines were strong, their emotional regulation improved. Their academic progress was ahead of schedule. The psychologist noted that the boys displayed greater stability in Richard's home. She's noted reduced anxiety behaviors after extended stays in the mansion. Every professional observation fed Richard's belief that he had made the right decision, that he was saving them from a life of uncertainty, that he was fixing what Ethan should have fixed long ago. Still, something in him stirred each time Liam or No cried for their mother, something he tried to ignore, something that whispered he hadn't fully understood what he took from Emily. But he buried that thought under layers of justification. The boys were safer with him, that was enough. One evening, as Richard prepared dinner with the chef, No tugged at his pant leg. "Can Mommy come here?" he asked quietly. Richard paused, surprised by the question. He said, "Maybe one day." No lowered his head. "But we miss her here." Something in Richard wavered. Just for a moment. Another night, Liam asked if they could visit their old neighborhood so he could remember what it looked like. Richard hesitated. "There's nothing there for you anymore." Liam frowned. "Mom's there." Richard didn't respond. Across the city, Emily was pushing her body too far. One afternoon, while working her second shift, she fainted in the supply room. Her coworker found her on the floor and called an ambulance. At the hospital, doctors said she was dehydrated, exhausted, and severely malnourished. They told her she needed rest. She told them she couldn't afford rest. She was discharged the same night and went straight from the hospital to her parenting class, because missing it wasn't an option. The next visitation nearly broke her completely. The boys ran into her arms, crying harder than usual, overwhelmed by the inconsistency of their lives. They asked when they could come home. They asked why she looked so tired. They asked why she smelled like disinfectant and hospital soap. Emily tried to hide her fatigue, but the Sikh supervisor took notes. Emily wanted to scream, "I'm tired because I'm fighting for them." But she said nothing. She hugged them tighter instead. The breaking point came 2 days later. Emily received a letter from Sex stating that the next phase of evaluation would include home visits to Richard's mansion and her shelter. She knew immediately how uneven the comparison would be. A polished mansion versus a crowded shelter, there was no contest. She would fail before the evaluation even began. She walked through the city that night with numb legs and burning lungs, unable to understand how she was supposed to win a battle she never agreed to fight. The cold bit at her skin, rain soaked through her thin coat. She felt invisible in a city full of people who didn't know her name, her story, or the children she would die for. She wandered until she reached the exact spot where Ethan used to walk her home when they were younger, long before the boys were born, before secrets were kept, before grief took everything. She sat on the curb, hugging her knees, and sobbed with an ache so deep it felt an ending. But a moment later, just when she thought she would break for good, another feeling rose inside her, slow at first, then powerful, a feeling she hadn't tasted in months. Defiance. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, stood, and turned toward the shelter with a steadiness she didn't have earlier. If the system wanted her to fail, she would force her way through it. If it wanted her to break, she would survive out of spite. If it wanted to take her boys forever, it would have to fight harder than she had fought for everything else in her life. She didn't have money, she didn't have lawyers, she didn't have influence. But she had something Richard Hamilton had never understood. She had nothing left to lose except her sons. And a mother with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous opponent anyone could face. The story of Emily Carter and Richard Hamilton is, at its core, a lesson about power, how it shapes people, how it distorts intentions, and how it quietly decides who wins in a world where justice is supposed to belong to everyone. It shows us how the line between right and wrong is rarely clear when the scales are tipped by wealth, influence, and fear. It reminds us that the truth does not always prevail on its own, and that love, no matter how deep, how pure, how desperate, can be crushed beneath forces that never once needed to prove themselves morally superior. What we learn from this story is that the world does not always reward the people who deserve the most. It rewards the people who can take the most. At the heart of the lesson lies Emily, a mother with nothing but love, resilience, and the determination to keep her sons safe. She is a portrait of the millions of women who fight battles behind closed doors, balancing poverty, single parenthood, and systems built without compassion for those who fall outside society's privileged lines. Emily's story shows us how easily the world can misinterpret struggle as failure. Her sacrifices, working long hours, taking multiple jobs, choosing hunger so her children could eat, should have been seen as proof of dedication, not evidence of instability. Yet the system, twisted by Richard's influence, used her hardship as a weapon against her. The lesson is painful but clear. In a world obsessed with appearances, sometimes the truth is buried beneath assumptions, and the strongest hearts are the ones society dismisses first. The story also teaches us something equally important about grief and control. Richard is not a villain in a traditional sense. He is a man who believes deeply in structure, stability, and legacy. His love for his son and grandsons is real, but his love filtered through the lens of power, love that becomes ownership, protection that becomes domination. His inability to see beyond his own beliefs leads him to justify every decision he makes, even those that destroy Emily's life. And that teaches us another vital lesson: good intentions, when paired with unchecked power, can do as much damage as cruelty. People who believe they are acting for the greater good can become dangerous, because they never stop to question whether their version of the greater good is actually good at all. Another lesson woven throughout the story is the devastating imbalance between wealth and fairness. The legal system portrayed here does not operate in a vacuum of morality. It responds to resources, documentation, expert opinions, and narratives crafted by those who can afford them. Emily never had a chance to stand on equal ground because the playing field was never equal. Richard could buy what Emily could only pray for: representation, time, housing, stability, credibility. This is not just fiction, it mirrors reality in countless custody battles where the poorer parent, despite being the emotional backbone of the family, loses to the parent with financial stability. The story teaches us that justice too often depends not on truth, but on the one who has the power to shape it. Yet beneath the darkness of the plot, the lesson of human resilience shines. Emily's suffering is immense and her losses cut deep, but her spirit never breaks. Each time life pushes her down, she rises not because she is unshakable, but because her love for her children is stronger than her despair. Her perseverance is a reminder that the most powerful force in the world is not wealth or influence, it is a mother who refuses to give up. Her determination teaches us that strength is not measured by how many battles we win, but by how many times we stand up after losing everything. And in that sense, Emily's story is not just one of tragedy, it's one of hope forged in fire. The children Liam and Noah offer another perspective. Their innocence exposes the consequences of adult choices. They don't understand legal terms, custody hearings, or psychological evaluations. All they know is love, safety, and the terror of losing their mother. Through their eyes, we see how systems often forget that the heart of every battle is not paperwork, it is children who just want to feel loved and protected. Their confusion, their tears, and their attempts to understand a world too big from serve as a reminder that children are never collateral in the wars between adults. They absorb every wound, every shift in routine, every tension, and they remember. What the story ultimately teaches us is that power without empathy leads to destruction, that wealth without humanity can tear families apart, that stability built on manipulation is not stability at all. It shows us the cost of pride, the dangers of control, and the importance of humility. Richard's journey emphasizes how even well-meaning intentions can become weapons when driven by fear, grief, and a desire to erase the past instead of facing it. His inability to understand Emily, to see beyond her circumstances, becomes the root of everything that goes wrong. And finally, the greatest lesson is this: love is not enough on its own, but it is the only force strong enough to survive everything else. Emily's love is bruised, exhausted, and stretched to its limits, but it becomes her anchor. Her journey teaches us that even when the world feels stacked against us, even when we are outmatched in every tangible way, the love we carry can become the spark that keeps us alive long enough to change our fate. Sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones we fight for long after everyone else expects us to fall. The story leaves us with a truth that lingers: justice does not naturally rise to the top. It must be fought for fiercely and relentlessly, especially by those who have the least. And though Emily's path is brutal, her resilience shows that strength does not come from winning, it comes from refusing to stop fighting. If you found this content helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of my latest videos. If you have any ideas or topics you'd like me to cover, leave a comment below. I always read all your comments.